to dovetail with what Shin was talking about, if there is kind of one thing that you take away from this presentation, is that the current policy landscape around nitrogen policies are not really up to the scale of the challenge when it comes to addressing nitrogen pollution or nutrient pollution. And that has personally stimulated me to try and develop a new governance framework, which has a lot of similarities with what the CAFE framework that Shin was talking about, perhaps specifically more focused on the production side of things, but thinking about all the actors in the agri-food system. So the central points being, let me just make sure that I can see everyone and my slides. Okay, so that as awareness of nutrient pollution policy increases, it's important to understand the policy landscape. There has been in the past couple of years an unprecedented increase in awareness at international and national scales about the kind of the threat that nutrient pollution, and by nutrient pollution I'm including phosphorus in here as well. And so it's important to understand the policies that currently exist that both try to address nutrient pollution, but that also stimulate it. And this fundamental tension in policies that both encourage nutrient use and try to manage its pollution is something that is fascinating, but that also needs to be better understood. And this new database that we developed, specifically focused on nitrogen policies, reveals that tension between food security priorities and environmental protection priorities, and that, perhaps not surprisingly, at least right now, food security priorities are winning out. By that I mean policies that either facilitate the commerce of nitrogen products or subsidize their use. And it highlights this central challenge of how we manage this essential agricultural input. And it suggests that there is a need for more innovative public and private policy. And I know that there's been, or there are going to be presentations, and at least there is expertise within this group around other agricultural inputs like pesticides. And I think a similar kind of innovative, holistic, comprehensive, integrated, whatever buzzword you want to use, approach that considers all the actors in the agri-food system that ultimately influence what happens at the farm level is necessary. And so I'll present briefly this project that I'm leading called Governing Nutrient Pollution Beyond Farmers, which is focused on developing a new type of governance framework targeting non-farmer actors across the agri-food system. So just to give briefly a bit of background, but again, Shin has done an excellent job covering all of this. There is increasing awareness that nutrient pollution is a big deal. These are just some news reports from the past couple of months in terms of the increased number of toxic algae blooms. Obviously, in France, this whole issue of algues vertes, green algae in Brittany is a huge issue. I'm actually working with the Sciences Po Law Clinic, and we're going to Brittany next week to start writing an independent report analyzing the current kind of governance system there and propose more innovative approaches. The country of the Netherlands, before COVID, the stikstof crisis, the nitrogen crisis, was dominating the headlines and still is to a large extent, and leading to pretty radical proposals that go beyond trying to make the existing system more efficient and arguably are trying to be a bit more transformational in terms of cutting the amount of livestock production. And then in terms of the actual response to it, globally, there is now this UN global campaign on sustainable nitrogen management. There was a Colombo declaration back in 2019, just before the pandemic, where the signatories committed to halving nitrogen waste by 2030. And there was a UN Environment Assembly resolution on sustainable nitrogen management as well. And so there's clearly increasing awareness, and so serious action on nutrient pollution is an increasingly feasible option. If we're looking just within the EU level, even though there is perhaps a more robust regulatory system here to be able to directly target farmers and fine them or tax them or monitor them than, say, in the United States, the ambition in the EU is amongst the highest really in the world when you look at this new farm to fork strategy that the EU has, and specifically the goal, again, to reduce nutrient losses by 50% and reduce the amount of synthetic fertilizer use by 20%. Arguably, the kind of current system of policies and laws in place are not really up to the challenge, even though something like the EU Nitrates Directive or the National Emission Ceiling Directive, they have been successful to a degree to achieve the kind of targets that the farm to fork strategy is suggesting around nutrients requires probably a more innovative policy approach. So the most important, or one of the most important first steps then is to really understand, well, what is the current policy landscape? And so as part of the International Nitrogen Management System project, INMS, which is essentially trying to develop an IPCC for nitrogen, one of the tasks we had was to develop a global database of national policies around nitrogen. And actually the most difficult step in this process was coming up with policy categories. Because, you know, if you would ask me before this whole process, David, what is a nitrogen policy? I would have, in my head, pretty simple. Well, this is a nitrogen policy and that isn't a nitrogen policy. And yet when you really start thinking about it, and especially because of the unique chemistry of nitrogen, and the fact that it exacerbates pretty much every environmental problem you can think of, in some ways, every policy is a nitrogen policy, in which case a policy database is completely useless. And so we had to really kind of think critically about what counted as a nitrogen policy or not. So I'm not going to go through this whole table, but this kind of outlines, there were some more traditional policy categories that we could use, like regulatory policies and economic policies. But then we had to kind of come up with some new categories that encompassed some of the ways that, a lot of the ways that countries talk about nitrogen environmental policy. So this framework category, for example, was there are a lot of countries that have these broad action plans that towards biodiversity or sustainable agriculture. So we use as an example here, what in Egypt, they have an Egyptian biodiversity strategy and action plan, which includes broad objectives for biodiversity conservation, including control of fertilizers and pesticides. So it clearly explicitly mentions a key source of nitrogen pollution, but without anything more specific than that. So we had that, we decided to create this category of framework policies and also policies that then delegate authority to specific regions. The other thing categories that we had to create was spend a lot of time initially thinking about, well, we're just focusing on nitrogen pollution policies that try to limit nitrogen pollution. But then we thought, well, I mean, there are obviously a lot of policies out there that inadvertently are the causes of or drivers of nitrogen pollution. Most explicitly the ones that incentivize nitrogen use, but also then the ones that regulate the commerce and trade of nitrogen itself. It's important to understand where those policies are, both because they are drivers, but also from a more glass half full perspective. When you're trying to reform nitrogen policy or trying to make it more with a more sustainable management perspective, reforming some of these types of policies, the commerce and pro-nitrogen policies, might actually be an interesting way to do it. You know, in the EU, for example, and in other countries, they have these cross-compliance rules where if you want to continue to receive subsidies, you need to comply with certain environmental rules. So you could imagine something like that with nitrogen subsidies or fertilizer subsidies. So anyway, we felt it was important to have all these different categories. This is just to summarize the kind of breakdown we found over 2,700 of these categories. And sorry, I'm not following I see that there's something in the things going on in the chat. So Thierry, just let me know if I should answer something in the moment. But so we identified over 2,700 policies using the Ecolex database, which is this massive database of over 200,000 environmental policies and laws from all over the world. And just the main, I won't get into the details here, but the dominant sink in terms of the dominant focus environmentally of nitrogen policies when they were focused on a sink was in water, making up over about half of the policies when they were focused on a specific sink. And when they were focused on a specific sector, they made up agriculture made up about 2/3 of those. And then Europe was the most dominant region in terms of nitrogen policy. I just wanted to zoom in specifically on agriculture because obviously agriculture is the dominant source of nitrogen and nutrient pollution. And when you first see this, when you see that agriculture, 2/3 of the sectoral policies around nitrogen, so 942 out of over 1,400 are focused on agriculture, your first impression might be, okay, that's actually quite good because that roughly reflects, and again, this is a very crude way of doing it, but the number of policies roughly reflects this pie chart. If I was to tell you this is actually the breakdown of the different sources of nitrogen pollution, it would actually look relatively representative. Around 2/3 to 3/4 of nitrogen pollution also comes from the agricultural sector. So you might think, okay, well, actually the number of policies reflect where most of the pollution is coming from. But when you actually break down this total number of agricultural policies into the different policy types, you'll notice that commerce and what we call pro-nitrogen or fertilizer subsidies make up around 2/3 of the policies within the agricultural policy. So policies that either facilitate or encourage nitrogen use make up the bulk of agricultural policies, and that these what we term in the paper core nitrogen policies, so economic and regulatory policies that really set quantifiable constraints on nitrogen pollution, they make up only about 1/4 of the agricultural policies. So when you think about this tension between policies that try to are more focused on the food security aspect that these essential inputs provide versus the environmental threats that they pose, there is clearly a bias towards the food security angle. And that when you break it down at a regional level, those tensions are even more stark. So again, this is a very crude disaggregation. We disaggregated into OECD countries and then non-OECD countries with high nitrogen surplus and non-OECD countries with low nitrogen surplus. And so just the dark orange and the dark green are the commerce and pro-nitrogen policies. You can see that even in OECD countries, about half of the policies in OECD countries are concerned with either the commerce of fertilizer, regulating the commerce and trade of fertilizer, versus, and then less than half are actually focused on trying to put quantifiable constraints on nitrogen pollution. And obviously in non-OECD countries, that divide is even more distinct, right? So places with high nitrogen surplus, there is commerce policies dominate, and in non-OECD countries with low nitrogen surplus, so think, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where you have more of a predominance of fertilizer subsidy programs, those tend to dominate. And that's totally understandable as well when you have large parts of the world that desperately need to increase the amount of nutrient inputs that they apply. But it just shows you this tension then between food security concerns and environmental concerns. And so the findings also revealed some critical challenges that I just want to highlight. The first is a lack of policy integration, which is perhaps not particularly surprising when it comes to nitrogen, in that nitrogen doesn't respect the kind of policy silos that we've created to try and address our environmental problems, right? We typically have a climate policy, a water policy, an air policy, a biodiversity policy. Nitrogen doesn't care about those divisions. It exacerbates all of those. So, for example, when you look at the famous planetary boundaries figure of each wedge in the planetary boundaries, even though nitrogen and phosphorus is one of the few planetary boundaries we've actually exceeded, it also makes achieving the other planetary boundaries much harder as well. So there's that siloed approach, and which means that if you don't take a more integrated approach to, especially to nitrogen pollution, you are at the risk of pollution swapping, of exacerbating one form of nitrogen pollution versus another. And also the professional incentives for a more integrated approach are absent. One anecdote that I keep going back to is I was involved at the EU level a couple of years ago, developing an integrated approach, an integrated policy approach for nitrogen. And we had EU kind of employees in the Commission from the water team and from the air team in DG Environment. And there's a broad understanding of the need for an integrated approach, but the professional incentives weren't there to create such an approach. If you're on the water team, you're there for 4 or 5 years. You're evaluated on whether member states reach certain targets with regards to water. You're not necessarily rewarded. You're not rewarded for a more integrated approach that combines air and water and climate and biodiversity. At least at the time, that was not the case. And so how we remedy those professional incentives, I think, is important. There's humanity's complex relationship with nitrogen, which in many ways is a microcosm of the sustainable development challenge. How do we increase the well-being of everyone on this planet, especially the world's poorest, without completely messing up the planet at the same time? In many ways, that is the central challenge of how we manage nutrients. And right now we have this dominance of commerce and pro-nitrogen policies. And so maybe can you reform those policies to make to take advantage of their dominance in the policy landscape right now, with commerce policies, for example, we explored with Tim searching a few years ago, and I'll speak about this later on in the presentation, about the possibility of having performance or design standards on certain fertilizers that are sold by the fertilizer industry, for example. And then just generally, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but that making and enforcing and monitoring any policy, environmental policy is obviously what I'm interested in the agricultural sector is hard. Food security is obviously a dominant concern, and that often wins out against environmental priorities. You're spread out over hundreds of millions of hectares, and so monitoring and enforcement is super difficult, particularly when you're dealing with a diffuse pollution source. And the agricultural lobby, and by that I mean both farmers, but also the various actors within the agri-food system, are a very powerful lobby. And when it comes to, I know the statistics in the US, I imagine it's a similar dynamic in Europe, perhaps not in other parts of the world, but the average age of a farmer in the United States is 58. And your average 58-year-old, predominantly white, predominantly male farmer is not going to be your target demographic to adopt new practices, be a bit more innovative in how they farm, even though there are a portion, obviously, of farmers that do that. That is not kind of your the predominant farmer type. So this is just to get to then to perhaps start thinking a bit more expansively and building on what Shin was talking about. This idea that most of our nutrient pollution policies, our environmental policies that do focus on trying to limit nutrient pollution, so both nitrogen and phosphorus, focus predominantly on changing farmer behavior, right? How can we change the incentives that farmers face to improve their nutrient management, either it be through taxation or fines or limit thresholds, and that kind of singular fixation on farmers ignores the fact that farmers are just, so farmers are the small one here, are just one node in a much larger agri-food system, right? And it's not just building on what Shin was saying earlier about how there are nitrogen losses at multiple stages in the food system. I'm particularly with this project interested in the fact that farmer decision-making is influenced by all these other actors in the agri-food system. And that often their choices about what they can do are constrained through contractual obligations, economic obligations, regulatory obligations, that they have no control over or very little control over. So what this new governance framework that we're working on is suggesting is that if you target these non-farmer actors in the agri-food system, that's another way to actually influence what happens at the farm level. So still on the production side of things. And I'll give a specific example of that. But just to give you a sense that, so the kind of driving question behind this new research framework builds on the fact of the existing policy landscape and the limitations of that landscape. How do you reduce agricultural nutrient pollution without regulating farmers? That's particularly of concern in the US because of the lack of any bite of most regulation in the US when it comes to the agricultural sector. I would slightly rephrase this question in a European context, where obviously you can reduce agricultural nutrient pollution while regulating farmers, but given the ambition of the targets at the EU level, I would argue that the current regulatory structure is probably inadequate. And so the idea is to design this new governance framework focused on non-farmer actors in the agri-food system that can influence farm level management. And by doing that, you turn a non-point source problem, so a very diffuse pollution problem, into a series of point source problems where it's a much more concentrated group of actors that you can focus on. So the framework is, or the kind of project is split into three components of mapping the agri-food system from a nutrient perspective, so understanding what are the forces that influence farm level nutrient management. Then we're working with law clinics. So I started it with Columbia in New York, and now I'm working with Sciences Po in Paris, to design the new governance and legal intervention based on our understanding of this agri-food system, and finally create a decision support tool to help stakeholders and policymakers compare. So first is this using systems mapping. So I'm sure many of you know this tool, but and this is just a very rough draft of the last last version of our systems map. in the US context, but to try and map the major economic and regulatory, informational, cultural forces that ultimately influence farmer nutrient management decisions. And what's nice about this tool, even though it becomes this very big spaghetti diagram, is that it's a way to bring together sociologists, economists, lawyers, biophysicists, and then other stakeholders from the fertilizer industry to farmers to cooperatives, to create a single joint product and understanding of what are the major forces that influence farmer decision making. And then from this, start to identify leverage points for new types of interventions that we might not have otherwise thought about. So then the second component being designing these new governance interventions, targeting non-farmer actors, but that ultimately influence farm level nutrient management decisions. So what I mean by that, and just to give one example here, this, so if you're focusing, for example, on processors and traders in the agri-food system, there are some companies that already have got sustainable supply chain codes, like Unilever, for example, includes a sustainable nitrogen management requirement in its procurement standards. But I haven't seen any data, independent data, or even Unilever data evaluating the effectiveness of such a requirement. And so increasing the transparency of those kinds of codes, and even mandating those types of codes, that they are common across all major food companies, would be one example where you are targeting a non-farmer actor in the agri-food system, but that it is ultimately spilling down to the farm level. And we'd also have to have we have to consider, and we're doing this in specific, when we're looking at specific case studies, you know, this isn't all about just adding additional or indirect costs spilling down to the farmer. This is also about spreading the risk across all of the actors in the agri-food system that have a role to play in limiting nutrient pollution, not just from their own activities, but from their indirect influence on what farmers do. And then finally, and Shin, I apologize, this is me adapting a figure of yours for my own expense, but developing a decision support tool to help decision makers compare then the environmental, economic, social, and political aspects of these different interventions that we developed. So I'm happy to answer questions about that. There's actually a much simpler way to describe what I just did. So the students that I'm working with at the Sciences Po Law Clinic did a very 3-minute video describing this idea, and from a Brittany context, because we contributed to this Brittany public consultation a few months ago. And so if you don't mind, I'll just play, and Jay, let me know if you can hear the video. But this is a little animation describing this project in a much more, hopefully, compelling way, though it is in French. So the French speakers have an advantage here. Can you hear that?
I'm not sure we can get the sound.
No, you can't hear that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's the issue with Zoom. It's difficult to broadcast video because the sound doesn't go.
Okay.
Well, I think the sound has to go through your mic, which is not possible.
Okay. Well, don't worry then. You can already see the amazing portrait of me here. That's the most important part of the That's the most important part of the video anyway. But it just summarizes in a more kind of, see if I can just get some of you can see at least some of the images here that they're, and this was just one of the students that used animation software, you know, saying, look, you know, most policies focuses on the farmer, but there's the whole système agroalimentaire with all these other actors that also contributes to pollution, and that if we were to expand the regulatory kind of envelope, the policy horizon, and then if you also consider banks and insurance companies and all this kind of stuff, that you focus on the whole système agroalimentaire, as they say, you could have more luck in actually influencing what happens at the farm level. And actually, thanks to this video, there were over 200 contributions to this public consultation, and our contribution got the most votes, or their contribution, I should say, got the most votes, which was cool. And as a result, we were invited to come to Brittany, meet with several people, which is what we're doing next week, and writing an independent report, kind of evaluating the current approach to regulating green algae in Brittany. For those of you that know a bit, the European system, Brittany is one of the hotspots of nitrogen pollution. and they've been trying for years to limit the green algae problem in Brittany with little luck, even though they've managed to reduce a lot of nitrate runoff because of just the lag time in the groundwater and things like that. There's just been a real problem in addressing green algae. So we're trying to propose kind of a different approach. In the last couple of minutes here, I just want to kind of put a bit more meat on the bone of what I mean when I say focusing on non-farmer actors to influence farm level nutrient management. I'll use just a specific case study focusing on the fertilizer industry. So we actually took our inspiration. This was work with Tim Searchinger. We used as inspiration the fuel efficiency standards for cars. So the beauty of fuel efficiency standards for cars, the idea being, instead of mandating that drivers limit their driving or how fast they drive, though in the Netherlands they're doing that now for nitrogen, you give drivers no choice but to purchase more fuel efficient cars over time, right? So this is just a graphic of the fuel efficiency standards in the United States, where they were under the Obama administration, now under the Biden administration, they're being used as a climate policy tool, mandating increases in fuel efficiency to then lower the amount of carbon dioxide per kilometer driven. And obviously that's being done in the EU as well. And so we asked ourselves, what would that look like for the fertilizer industry? Well, instead of regulating the kinds of practices and technologies or practices that farmers do and trying to regulate how they behave, or in addition to doing that, I should say, impose design standards or performance standards or sales standards on the fertilizer industry. And so that the types of fertilizer products that are being applied by and services that farmers are using from the fertilizer industry are improving and becoming more environmentally efficient over time. And if you look at the history of environmental policy, typically it's industries that are highly concentrated and where the same companies that are responsible for the problem are also can potentially profit from the solution. As much as I may personally disagree with that dynamic, it is a dynamic that is held true over time, whether you look at the pesticide story, or I'll briefly talk about the ozone story. But here you have 5 companies that dominate this is the North American fertilizer industry, and we were focusing on North America. And 4 out of these 5 companies produce either more efficient fertilizer products or services that are currently niche products because there is little farmer demand, and there's little farmer demand because they feel either the products aren't adapted to their particular situation or they're too expensive. And so there's this chicken and egg problem, which we felt that's what the role of government is for, is to force, at least one of the roles of government is to force technology innovation in a sector that is very conservative, the fertilizer sector. And so we looked, I'm happy to share the paper with those that are interested. I'm not going to go through the results now, just to say that there are similarities with other success stories in environmental policy. So for those of you familiar with the ozone story, the Montreal Protocol, DuPont, they were the major world producer of CFCs, that was a big culprit when it came to ozone depletion, ultimately became wholly supportive of the Montreal Protocol, the International Ozone Agreement, not because they were convinced by Greenpeace's arguments, but because they also produced a patent-protected alternative that they could charge a premium for, and that an international agreement that implicated every country in the world would create a global level playing field for their alternative. So in the end, it was a massive economic opportunity for them. Now, they ended up being a dominant player in the market for alternatives, not the only player, but a dominant player. And so there is a similar dynamic, or we would argue there's a similar dynamic with the fertilizer industry, in that if for those first movers that are willing to bet on more enhanced efficiency fertilizers and services and adapt them to specific crops and climates, that there is an opportunity there for a market opportunity to really dominate the market for more sustainable nitrogen management options. Similarly, there are alternatives that don't require fertilizer at all, right? Shin talked about there are companies looking into genetic engineering of seeds or new coatings, where you can make non-leguminous crops like corn and wheat leguminous, being able to fix a portion of their nitrogen. But this is kind of the idea and the dynamic. And in fact, India has trialed a version of this idea, and some of you may be familiar with this. This was a couple of years ago, but that India mandated that all of the urea, which is the main nitrogen fertilizer used there, that is either produced in India or imported to India, be coated with neem oil, which is a natural product that delays, it kind of acts as a natural urease inhibitor mainly, to delay the release of nitrogen in the soil. And so instead of regulating the hundreds of millions of farmers in India, you're regulating the 30 factories that produce urea and the importers. And also the subsidized urea, it's a way, so a lot of the subsidized urea in India before this was being diverted for industrial uses as an adhesive. And by coating it with neem oil, you're actually making it useless as in its industrial capacity. So there was kind of this double win for policymakers there. So this is just to recap what I talked about in terms of understanding that it's important to understand the policy landscape, and that policy landscape reveals this tension between food security and environmental protection, which highlights this need that we need to think more innovatively about new approaches to deal with both public and private policy around nutrient pollution. And then I introduced this new governance framework we're working on to try and think about that in a more innovative way, focusing on non-farmer actors in the agri-food system that can influence what happens at the farm level. So with that, that's everything. Thanks very much, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, David. And we will now give the floor to Nicolas Guilpart for 5-minute discussion of your talk.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Was very interesting, and you know, I'm a cropping system agronomist, and this policy analysis is quite new to me, and I've been surprised. I didn't know you could put policy into a database like you did, and I think it's great, and it opens a lot of new opportunity to have this global database of policy about nitrogen. And to me, it's also a very good sign that there are nitrogen policies pretty much in every country. And I was surprised that about this dominance of what you call commerce and pro-nitrogen policies for the sector of agriculture. Well, I have 3 questions, but 2 main questions. The first one, and we started, I think, this discussion in the presentation before. Do you think it would be possible to link your database of policies with maps and maybe dynamic maps of nitrogen surplus in the world to try to see if you can find any association between nitrogen surplus and policies, to maybe identify policies that would best work in a specific context? That's the first question.
So you've read my mind in terms of what we want to do next. I mean, you know, this is an inevitably crude first evaluation of nitrogen policies, because we're really just looking at the total number of policies. You know, we're not looking at the area which they cover, and we're especially not looking at their effectiveness. And so the next step for me would be to, and where it would be especially interesting, is to really understand the effectiveness of different policies and whether there are specific instruments that are more effective than others, whether there are the kinds of ministries that are involved, just a much more kind of granular linking of the policy landscape with how their environmental effectiveness and other criteria around policy evaluation, like cost effectiveness, the distribution socially, like who bears the burden of the policy, right? Does it fall predominantly on farmers versus consumers versus others? So there are a lot of questions that I think can start to be explored with this database. It was used as a stepping stone back. There's this new paper that was published in Environmental Research Letters just a couple of weeks ago, building on our database in South Asia. So I mean, in a huge way, they managed to combine it bottom up and top down. But I think there are a lot of questions, including what you outlined, that can start to be explored, hopefully. So yes, I agree. We haven't started doing what you suggest, but that is definitely the next step.
Okay, thanks, and we look forward to the results. My second question is because you highlight the need of the opportunities at the food system scale, and I have 2 questions. The 2 parts of that question. The first one is, have you identified any policy that effectively address the nitrogen problem at the food system scale? Does it exist today? And the second part of the question is, I mean, from an agronomy perspective, we do know that there are some very effective way of reducing the nitrogen leaks to the environment, like rotations, cover crops, the use of legume crops, and is it something that you can track with the database if those I mean those levers at the field scale are considered in the policy?
Both really interesting questions. So the first one, to my understanding, there is no policy that deals with nitrogen pollution at the food system scale, because this perspective first of nitrogen pollution being, this term nitrogen pollution is relatively new. The concept of the nitrogen cascade is relatively new, right? Up until just a decade or two ago, nitrogen was considered in each of its compounds, right? Nitrate and ammonia and nitrous oxide. So just the idea of having a joined up approach to nitrogen is relatively new. And then this idea of looking not just at the farm scale, but across the entire food system is very new. I mean, the most innovative policy that I can think of right now, well, in addition to the India urea policy, and I haven't seen no data evaluating how effective that is, but I know Germany has a national nitrogen strategy where they set ceilings for total nitrogen use and pollution. So that's across all nitrogen compounds. But I don't know, I think that's across all sectors, but I don't know if it's like a true food, if you could consider it a true food system. And then with regards to specific measures, that's also a really good question. And the answer would be no, unless you dived into the PDF, from the database, you can then link to the specific policies and there will be information there. But usually a lot of these policies kind of leave, either just list some possible actions or leave that vague for the implementing agencies to look into. But I think, as you say, I mean, clearly, the focus on cover crops and rotations is increasingly of interest to people. I know, for example, in the US, the discussions around this Build Back Better plan, and who knows whether it'll pass, but there's billions of dollars for cover crops and legumes, and so there is clear interest in that, but that would definitely be something that we need to improve in the next generation of the database.
Okay. Well, I think that were my two main questions. Maybe we have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we have a question from Niklas. If your question is very short, Nicolas, you can just ask it. Otherwise,
Niklas, you can go.
Niklas.
Yeah, thanks, David, for the presentation. I'm working on pesticide use, so we have a very similar vision there, that we actually need policies that are more holistic, that cover the agri-food value chain also. Otherwise, you probably don't actually reach your goals. And so I really liked your presentation of your framework. And my question would be, should we not think actually one step wider? Because a lot of these cropping systems, they actually have interconnected goals usually. So if you go, for example, in more extensive systems, you would also reduce pesticide use and not only nitrogen use. So I was thinking, does it make a lot of sense to have this this very integrated framework, but then only focus on a very restricted goal? Because I think most of these goals are actually interlinked. So I was thinking, and it has been proposed to have these more food policy frameworks and so on. So what's your perspective on that?
I completely agree that ultimately, it doesn't make sense to reproduce ad nauseam, the kind of same framework for different inputs, right? So if there is a way to have a joined up approach, and I'd be really interested to continue talking with you about that. I do think that there are inevitably specificities, right? Peculiarities to nutrients. So when I think about imposing performance standards on design standards on fertilizer companies, that would obviously, you could imagine doing a similar thing for pesticide companies, but obviously it would look different. And then other policies would be for example, imposing stricter recycling standards on wastewater treatment companies, and that would be something probably unique in nitrogen. But then if you think about, for example, sustainable supply chain codes for companies, they're presumably including both pesticide and nutrient management, you could imagine there. Also, one idea we're exploring is reforming organic labeling standards to include stricter nutrient management. You could imagine, I mean, there already you're not allowed any real synthetic pesticides in organic farming. Also, in terms of the training of crop advisors, I know better in a US context, but the role of certified crop advisors in the United States is huge in terms of influencing farmer decision making on nutrients. And 90% of those certified crop advisors are employed by retailers, the people that actually sell those fertilizers. So there is this direct conflict of interest in one of the most important relationships that farmers have. And I imagine that they get the same advice on pesticides from the same people. So the short answer to your question is yes, there probably should be a combined framework. I think the reason there isn't right now is because of the different policy streams that go on around this. But ideally, for efficiency's sake, you should combine them. From an economist perspective, you definitely want to combine them.
Maybe we can take last question by Raja.
Yes, thank you very much, David, for this nice presentation. It was very interesting to see your global view on what happened in terms of policies all around the world. I have actually two questions, but maybe the main one is concerning what we saw in the presentation just before, which showed that the yields are very low in Africa, for example. So we could think about policies that will encourage farmers in Africa or in poor countries, at least, to put more fertilizers. This will be a good thing, I think, to respond to the question of food security, but also to the question of climate change, because using fertilizers is also a source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we will win on both sides. And more specifically, because local pollution are less severe in this country. So do you think that we could put this issue of fertilizer regulation as an international policies framework, and maybe think about international agreements on this question? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really important question, and there is actually movement on this. There is the Sri Lanka is putting forward a new resolution in the UN Environment Assembly to kind of increase global coordination around nitrogen, and they're proposing what they're calling this interconvention coordination mechanism, where all the different international environmental conventions that deal with nitrogen in some way, so climate, ozone, air, water, have a kind of central forum to discuss nitrogen-related issues. And for me personally, and Shin will know this is the first real project we interacted over, but the way I got into this whole field of nitrogen and nutrients was through the Montreal Protocol, the International Ozone Agreement, because nitrous oxide, which we commonly know is the third most important greenhouse gas, is also the largest remaining threat to the ozone layer. And so I've been calling for a decade now for the Montreal Protocol to consider taking on nitrous oxide, and now there seems to be increasing appetite for that to NGOs in certain countries. And so I think you will see, hopefully in the next year or two, increasing attention paid to nitrogen at the global scale. And then the question, as you rightly point out, becomes how do you manage the tension between the too much and the too little? And just to give one brief example, in the Montreal Protocol, the way they did that with CFCs was to say, okay, we understand that CFCs, because they were used in air conditioning and refrigeration, that for some countries that really have low per capita use of CFCs, the controls of the Montreal Protocol aren't going to apply until per capita consumption goes above a certain threshold. And so you could imagine something similar to fertilizer or nitrogen consumption writ large, to say, for those countries that are struggling to guarantee food security for their populations, until your per capita nitrogen consumption goes beyond, or your nitrogen surplus, however you want to, goes beyond a certain threshold, the controls on nitrous oxide will not apply to you. So, but it's really important, and it will be one of the most challenging, I think, efforts ever to deal with an environmental problem, is how you deal with this tension between, because we don't know how to deal with an essential input in environmental policy. We're used to banning things. We're used to banning CFCs or harmful pesticides, and you can't really ban fertilizer. So you have to just think of a more, it's all around efficiency or more transformational change, like what we were hearing in terms of the natural farming or zero nitrogen budget farming. So yes, it's challenging but exciting.
I think we have a follow-up by Raja.
I don't know if there is any other question. Otherwise, I have a small question. I think it will be connected to the presentation of Alain Carpentier tomorrow. What about taxation? I am economist, and from the economist's point of view, the best way to regulate pollution from, for example, for fertilizers would be to have taxes. And we don't have any experience. I don't. In your results, at least, I didn't see any taxes. Or do you have any idea why we don't use this supposed to be efficient way or instrument to regulate fertilizer use?
In short, because they are incredibly unpopular, and there is no politician that would ever try to pass a strong fertilizer tax on farmers. And at least from some of the economic work that I've seen, you would have to have a pretty huge tax on fertilizer to have a significant change in farmer behavior. And that the demand, again, I'm not an economist, so I apologize if I'm butchering this, but demand is pretty inelastic. And so you'd have to have a pretty high tax. So I think when you see, for example, the Dutch response, the farmers' Dutch response to the nitrogen crisis there, and the longest rush hour traffic you've ever seen in your life with all these tractors, you know, and that's without having a significant tax in place, then I think that's why you don't see as much appetite for that. So I agree, it would be probably could be quite efficient.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just a note about that, David. You're right about the inelasticity of fertilizer consumption to its price, and to work together with Raja on a paper, and it shows that we need to multiply the price of fertilizer by 3 to reduce its consumption by 50%. So it will be something very unpopular, I think. So I would like to thank you, David, for your very insightful presentation.